Okay, so kind of have a two-part question before I get into the rest of the reading. Then I'll do a reading chunk and just have like one or two more questions, and then the exit ticket. So kind of two parts here. In your opinion, would a literal thinker or an abstract thinker make a better detective? So remember, the literal focuses on the facts, might notice little details better, or an abstract thinker, someone who can see the bigger picture and connect ideas. Which one of those would make a better detective, and why? And then the second part is, does Christopher possess any other traits that might help him be a good detective? Go ahead and answer that in 3 to 4 sentences now. Okay, so now we're going to continue on reading to the end of the chapter. We're going to pick up at I said that I would be careful. It's about a quarter of the way from the top on page 38. I said that I would be careful, and then I said thank you to her for helping me with my question, and I went to number 43, which is the house next to Mrs. Shears's house. The people who live at number 43 are Mr. Wise and Mr. Wise's mother, who is in a wheelchair, which is why he lives with her, so he can take her to shops and drive her around. It was Mr. Wise who answered the door. He smelled of body odor and old biscuits and off popcorn, which is what you smell of if you haven't washed for a very long time, like Jason at school smells because his family is poor. I asked Mr. Wise if he knew who had killed Wellington on Thursday night. He said, "Bloody hell, policemen really are getting younger, aren't they?" Then he laughed, but I do not like people laughing at me, so I turned and walked away. I did not knock at the door of number 38, which is the house next to our house, because the people there take drugs, and father says that I should never talk to them, so I don't. And they play loud music at night, and they make me scared sometimes when I see them in the street. And it is not really their house. Then I noticed that the old lady who lives at number 39, which is on the other side of Mrs. Shears's house, so we're now here at number 39, right next to our house, was in her front garden cutting her hedge with an electric hedge trimmer. Her name is Mrs. Alexander. She has a dog. It's a dachshund, so she's probably a good person because she liked dogs. But the dog wasn't in the garden with her. It was inside the house. Mrs. Alexander was wearing jeans and training shoes, which old people don't normally wear. And there was mud on her jeans, and the trainers were New Balance trainers. She got on burgers. And the laces were red. I went up to Mrs. Alexander and said, "Do you know anything about Wellington being killed?" Then she turned the electric hedge trimmer off and said, "I'm afraid you're going to have to say that again. I'm a little deaf." So I said, "Do you know anything about Wellington being killed?" She said, "Oh, I heard about it yesterday. Dreadful, dreadful." I said, "Do you know who killed him?" And she said, "No, I don't." I replied, "Somebody must know, because the person who killed Wellington knows that they killed Wellington. Unless they were a mad person that didn't know what they were doing, or unless they had amnesia." And she said, "Well, I suppose you're right." I said, "Thank you for helping me with my investigation." And she said, "You're Christopher, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I live in number 36. And she said, "We haven't talked before, have we?" I said, "No, I don't like talking to strangers, but I'm doing detective work." She said, "I see you every day going to school." I didn't reply to this. She said, "It's very nice of you to come and say hello." I didn't reply to this either, because Mrs. Alexander is doing what is called chatting, where people say things to each other which aren't questions and answers and aren't connected. Then she said, "Even if it's only because you're doing detective work." And I said, "Thank you," again. And I was about to turn and walk away when she said, "I have a grandson your age." I tried to do chatting by saying, "My age is 15 years and 3 months and 3 days." And she said, "Well, almost your age." Then we said nothing for a little while until she said, "You don't have a dog, do you?" And I said, "No." She said, "You'd probably like a dog, wouldn't you?" And I said, "I have a rat." She said, "A rat? He's called Toby." Oh. And I said, "Most people don't like rats because they think they carry diseases like bubonic plague. But that's only because they lived in sewers and stowed away on ships coming from foreign countries where there were strange diseases. But rats are very clean. Toby is always washing himself, and you don't have to take him out for walks. I just let him run around my room so that he gets some exercise, and sometimes he sits on my shoulder or hides in my sleeve like it's a burrow. But rats don't live in burrows in nature, Mrs. Alexander said. Do you want to come in for tea? And I said, I don't go into other people's houses. She said, well, maybe I could bring some out here. Do you like lemon squash? I replied, I only like orange squash. Well, luckily, I have some of that as well. And what about Battenberg? I do not know because I do not know what Battenberg is. Oh, it's a kind of cake. It has 4 pink and yellow squares in the middle, and it has marzipan icing around the edge. I said, is it a long cake with a square cross section which is divided into equally sized alternately colored squares? What a question. And she said, yes, I think you could probably describe it like that. And I said, I think I'd like the pink squares, but not the yellow squares because I don't like yellow. And I don't know what marzipan is, so I don't know whether I'd like that. She said, well, I'm afraid marzipan is yellow too. Perhaps I should bring out some biscuits instead. Do you like biscuits? Yes, some sort of biscuits. I'll get a selection. Then she turned and went into the house. She moved very slowly because she was an old lady, and she was inside for more than 6 minutes. And I began to get nervous because I didn't know what she was doing in the house. I didn't know her well enough to know whether she was telling the truth about getting orange squash and Battenberg cake. And I thought she might be ringing the police, and then I'd get in much more serious trouble because of the caution. So I walked away. And as I was crossing the street, I had a stroke of inspiration about who might have killed Wellington. I was imagining a chain of reasoning inside my head, which was like this. 1. Why would you kill a dog? A, because you hated the dog. B, because you were mad. Or C, because you wanted to make Mrs. Shears upset. Second revelation. I didn't know anyone who hated Wellington. So if it was A, because you hated the dog, it was probably a stranger. I didn't know any mad people. So if it was B, because you were mad, it was also probably a stranger. And number 4, most murders are committed by someone who is known to the victim. In fact, you are most likely to be murdered by a member of your own family on Christmas Day. This is a fact. Wellington was therefore most likely to have been killed by someone known to him. If it was C, I only knew one person who didn't like Mrs. Shears, and that was Mr. Shears, who knew Wellington very well indeed. So he rests on this idea that C, because he wanted to make Mrs. Shears upset, was the most likely of all the answers. And he comes to the conclusion that the most likely candidate was Mr. Shears, who we are going to find out is her ex-husband. Says this meant that Mr. Shears was my prime suspect. Mr. Shears used to be married to Mrs. Shears, and they lived together until 2 years ago. Then Mr. Shears left and didn't come back. This was why Mrs. Shears came over and did lots of cooking for us after Mother died, because she didn't have to cook for Mr. Shears anymore, and she didn't have to stay at home and be his wife. And also Father said that she needed company and didn't want to be on her own. Okay, so now we know Mrs. Shears spends quite a bit of time in Christopher's house. Interesting. And sometimes Mrs. Shears stayed overnight at our house. And I liked it when she did because she made things tidy and she arranged the jars and pans and tins in order of their height on the shelves in the kitchen. And she always made their labels face outward, and she put the knives and forks and spoons in the correct compartments in the cutlery drawer. But she smoked cigarettes and said lots of things I didn't understand. For example, I'm going to hit the hay, and it's brass monkeys out there, and let's rustle up some tucker. And I didn't like when she said things like this because I don't know what she meant. And I don't know why Mr. Shears left Mrs. Shears because nobody told me. But when you get married, it is because you want to live together and have children. And if you get married in a church, you have to promise that you will stay together until death do us part. And if you don't want to live together, you have to get a divorce. And this is because one of you has done sex with somebody else, or because you are having arguments and you hate each other and you don't want to live in the same house anymore and have children. And Mr. Shears didn't want to live in the same house as Mrs. Shears anymore, so he probably hated her and might have come back and killed her dog to make her sad. I decided to try and find out more about Mr. Shears. Okay, so one final thing I want you to do is tell me 2 to 3 things that we learned about Mrs. Shears and Christopher's father in that section. Okay, so we learned one, that Mrs. Shears is divorced. Two, that Mrs. Shears spends a lot of time at Christopher's house. And three, that sometimes Mrs. Shears spends the night at Christopher's house as well. So I think maybe if you can start to put together the clues about Mrs. Shears and kind of her relation to Christopher and his family, then some of these pieces might start adding up for you. I don't know. I'm going to go ahead and stop here. I don't want to take any more time. So go ahead now. The 2 exit ticket questions that follow this video, get those done, and then you're good. I will see you guys on Monday. We will resume in the novel.